Hi, I'm Rob Pincus, one of the board members of Walk the Talk America and a firearms safety and use educator. I've been working for over 2 decades to help people generally be better prepared to use firearms to defend themselves or others, but also spent a lot of my time helping people understand how to be more responsible firearms owners. What are the best practices for not only use, but also for the storage and, of course, controlling access by others to their firearms. These things are all incredibly important when it comes to being responsible and, of course, doing what we need to do as freedom-loving Americans that have access to guns and making sure that we avoid as many potential negative outcomes as possible. But before we get into the details of how you might go about doing that, securing guns and using them with the best practices and even having them prepared for very quick use to defend yourself or others in a worst case scenario, we have to understand the firearms themselves. And what I find is that a lot of people just simply don't understand the very small differences in some cases between something like a hunting rifle and something like what the media might call an assault rifle, or that you might see used by a criminal, but also a gun that's very fun to use, something that's very easy to collect, something that's very easy to personalize, something that's used quite frequently in competition, or again just for recreational shooting, or even as a hunting gun, even though it may not look like what you would traditionally think of as a hunting gun. So I want to go spend a few minutes with different types of firearms, maybe address some of the myths, address some of the concerns that some people have about firearms, mostly from outside of the gun community. But even if you are a gun owner, if you've done a lot of shooting, hopefully something in this Guns 101 presentation will help you understand firearms and maybe even their owners a little bit better. The first thing I want to talk about is the different types of firearms in terms of category. There's generally the handgun category, a gun that is meant to be fired or at least designed so that it can be fired with one hand on the gun. Certainly a lot of times you'll see people put 2 hands on any of these type of handgun. We don't call it a hands gun, but generally when people are shooting it, obviously you have more control over the gun. It's more comfortable to shoot if you have 2 hands on it most of the time rather than just one, but it can be handled with just one hand. Putting 2 hands on the gun in the same place is really what makes this a handgun. There's only one point of contact. When we talk about teaching someone how to shoot, we talk about how to get a good one-handed or two-handed grip on this type of firearm. And these types of firearms come in 2 different categories primarily. You've got semi-automatic guns, which that is one of, and you've got revolvers with a cylinder that revolves between each shot. Both of these types of firearms, once they're loaded and ready to go, when you pull the trigger, one shot will come out of the gun. You release the trigger, it resets the mechanism. This gun, this slide, moves back and forth, ejecting an empty case, chambering another round, and allowing you to press the trigger again, firing a second shot. With this gun, this cylinder will revolve, so it will hold on to the empty case in this cylinder, rotate here so that this tube is now in front of the hammer, and that will be the round that gets fired next. Obviously, this gun is going to be slower to reload than this gun because the semi-automatic gun takes these interchangeable magazines. So that one of these magazines will be in there, it will drop out, you'll place another one in, the first round will get chambered, depending on which technique you use and exactly which gun you're using. That can happen in different ways, and then you'd fire the rest of the rounds and once again remove a magazine and put another magazine in. There are other types of guns that are semi-automatic outside of the handgun realm that may not use a magazine. They will use something that's called a clip. The fact is that clip and magazine are terms that are much debated by the more pedantic people inside of the gun community. For practical purposes, in media and in normal conversation, they're sort of used interchangeably, but they are technically different. A magazine is something that's completely contained like this, that holds the rounds. A clip will only hold on to a part of the round, and then it sort of pops out of the gun or falls out of the gun when you're done with it, and you would not reload it quickly. These magazines can be reloaded very quickly. But that's not going to be in the handguns, that's going to be in the rifle area. So again, when it comes to rifles, there are a few different types of rifles as well. Rifles are the first and most popular type of long gun that we're going to use. We've got handguns and long guns. The long gun is distinguished by the fact that when we're using it the way it's intended, we actually have 4 points of contact. So we've got our body, we've got our control hand, our support hand, and then our head is going to touch the back of the stock here when we're in our shooting position. So those 4 points of contact obviously give us more control. These guns are generally more powerful. Because of the 4 points of contact, we're more capable of higher level precision, shooting at longer ranges or at smaller targets. The optic choices, including magnified scopes, red dot sights, or even just a longer distance between a rear sight and a front sight than you would have on a handgun, mean that we can aim more precisely with this type of firearm. These firearms are also generally more complex than the handguns, and they also are going to be more powerful generally than the handguns, but not always the case. I'll get into some of the details on these guns and the differences amongst them in just a moment. But that rifle category does include the AR-15 that gets so much attention, again, with the politicians and with the media. So we're going to talk about the AR-15 a lot. And then the other type of long gun that we talk about is a shotgun. So this is a pump shotgun. Unlike most of the other guns, well, all of the other guns that I've actually touched so far, this gun, I have to do something manually between each shot. So when I push this forward, that would chamber one of these shotgun shells. I would pull the trigger, the gun would fire, and if I release the trigger, nothing happens in and of it by itself. Releasing the trigger isn't enough to fire another shot. I actually need to pump the gun again, ejecting an empty hull, which would look like this, pop out of there, and then a new round would be chambered when I push forward, and then I could shoot again. Now, the shotgun isn't the only type of gun that requires a manual action between each shot. We also have rifles that will require that. So you might have seen like a cowboy kind of lever action gun where someone shoots and then pushes a lever down that ejects an old round, pulls it back up, and then they can fire again. The Chuck Connors, the riflemen, back in the 50s and 60s, the cowboy action kind of movies and all the westerns, you saw a lot of the lever gun actions where the manipulation had to happen between each shot. Hunting rifles traditionally also need to be manipulated between each shot, and that's what this rifle is behind the little one that I picked up. And this is a bolt action rifle. And again, this is set up very typically for hunting. I've got my sling, so I can carry it around in the woods. I can go out to wherever it is I'm going to sit and hunt. When I get there, I have a box magazine, not a detachable magazine like we had with the handguns earlier. Now the magazine stays in the gun. It doesn't drop out, so I have to load this one maybe 4 or 5 rounds on this particular model. And then there's a bolt that operates above the magazine, pushing around into the chamber. I lock that, and then I can fire. To fire another round, I have to eject the old round, put a new round in, and I can fire again. And of course, this has a magnified scope, something that lets me see a little bit further and aim a little bit more precisely. So it's a very typical traditional hunting gun that does need to be manually operated between each shot. Now, that's several different types of guns, and there's some big differences amongst them. And again, just like I don't have a lever action gun, there's a few other types of guns that we don't have out here, but this is a really good overview. It is true that there are lever action shotguns. It is true that there are pump action rifles as well. Also inside of the shotgun, we have the breech type shotgun, which is going to break open with either 1 barrel or 2 barrels and need to be loaded by hand between each shot. And then it would be closed and we'd be able to fire again. So that gives you a general overview of the handguns and the long guns, and then within the long guns, the rifles and the shotguns. Let's go back to handguns, because handguns really are the most likely firearm that you are to come in contact with. If someone that you're trying to treat, someone that you're talking to, maybe someone that comes into your office, your clinic, or you're even in the public space, the most likely gun that someone's going to have is a handgun. There are almost 60 million people as of the fall of 2022 in the United States of America who can legally carry a concealed firearm for defensive purposes. And in 25 of the 50 states in the US, you do not need a permit. You don't need special permission from the government. If you already can legally own a gun, you can then legally carry that gun concealed in the public space. So that is almost 40 million people at last count that live under those rules. And then you've got another approaching 20 million people who actually have permits issued to them. And that's not even to count your security personnel or police officers, plainclothes police officers, off-duty police officers, hundreds of thousands of other people who may also be carrying guns in the public space. Well, they're probably not going to walk up to you carrying a hunting rifle or with a shotgun over their shoulder, but they may be carrying a handgun, probably concealed for personal defense, and you'll probably never know about it. And that's exactly how it's supposed to be, right? They only bring that gun out if they need to defend themselves or others, possibly including you, in a worst case scenario. The most typical types, as we talked about before, of handguns are going to be your semi-automatic handgun or a revolver. Now, traditionally, if you go back 20 or 30 years, many more people than today were carrying revolvers for self-defense. They're seen as being very reliable. They're relatively small, and the types that would be carried for defense. They're powerful enough to be trusted for defensive use, and they're relatively simple to use. Now, they do require more hand strength to use than a typical semi-automatic gun, a modern, what we call striker-fired semi-automatic gun. But the hand strength has never been seen as a big issue to overcome. The simplicity of pulling the trigger, the gun goes bang. Don't pull the trigger, it's hard to set this gun off as a double action revolver. I can smack against this trigger. This is not something you would want to do as far as a gun safety issue, but that trigger is just not going to move. It needs to be pulled, and I'll just quadruple check that this is empty. It needs to be pulled with a great deal of strength, relatively speaking, and a long distance to get this hammer to come back. You can see the revolver is turning, and then at some point that will release and the hammer would fly forward, striking the back of the round and causing a discharge of the ammunition and the bullet to come out of the barrel. So that takes a very deliberate action to pull back on that trigger all the way so that this gun goes off. When we think about a semi-automatic type firearm like this one, this is actually a Ruger 22 caliber gun. It shoots a very small round. Hold that close to the camera just so you get some idea of how small that round is. Compared to that little revolver that I was just holding, this is the round that revolver shoots, obviously much more powerful. The powder inside of that case is what propels the bullet. So much more powerful a powder charge and a much heavier bullet, which is going to do more damage to whatever it strikes. This 22 is the type of gun I grew up with. I actually grew up with a gun very, very similar to this one. The gun I shot the most, probably from the time I was 8 years old until I was 15, would be my guess, was a gun very much like this. And if you watch this trigger motion, you can see it's very light and very short. So a quarter or a fifth of the amount of pressure that I put into that revolver and very, very little travel distance. So when I say it's harder to shoot that revolver than it is the semi-automatic, that's what I'm talking about. But this gun would be very easy to shoot in terms of recoil, right? So you think about that powerful round going off inside of this gun, relatively lightweight. These probably weigh about the same, but that's a much more powerful round. You would have much more concussion, more blast, more noise, and more force coming back against your hand. The other thing about a revolver is nothing about the revolver absorbs any of that recoil force. The mechanism inside of a semi-automatic gun that releases the old round and chambers the next round does actually absorb some of that recoil. So this gun being heavier relative to the amount of weight and force being pushed out of the gun makes it much easier to shoot. So this is a very typical target gun, what we call a plinking gun, a recreational gun, could be a competition gun. Probably wouldn't do any hunting with this. You might go after squirrels or rabbits or something like that if you really want to to challenge yourself. But this is a very, very common gun in the United States. Ruger probably makes two of the most common guns, this manufacturer, in the United States of America, as far as especially people between 40 and 60 years old. You probably owned one of these at some point in your life, if not several of them, and you probably owned one of these, which is a 22 caliber rifle, shoots exactly the same round, and this is a Ruger Mark I, Mark II, Mark III, Mark IV, various models there. This is a Ruger 1022, and the reason that I'm pointing out this in particular is that Ruger has been a very generous contributor to the work of Walk the Talk America. So one of the most popular, one of the most established, respected gun brands in America is a backer of the work that we do, and very much appreciative of the mental health community interest in serving our community better. So I thought I'd give them a little shout out there. Going back to the handguns, again, this semi-automatic handgun is a 9mm handgun. If you think about the 9mm, this is the most common round that's used for personal defense. It's the most common round used by law enforcement in the U.S. It's also the round that's used in the handguns of our military. So all of our military branches use 9mm handguns. And this is a 9mm bullet, and again, to put that in perspective, let's take a look at the .22 caliber, the recreational round, that revolver round, that .357 round, or a .38 special round. They're both about the same from your perspective, or this 9mm round, which really lives kind of conveniently in the middle. It's a moderately powered handgun cartridge, and again, it's the choice for personal defense, home defense, handguns, as well as law enforcement and military handguns, really all around the world. This is a Glock 9mm, very common gun from the late 80s on in the United States of America. It's probably America's most popular handgun in terms of law enforcement guns and personal defense guns. When you load that magazine in and chamber a round, you then pull the trigger, you fire a shot, and these types of guns typically will hold anywhere from 12 to 20 rounds of ammunition. Now, while the standard magazine for this particular gun holds 17 rounds, it is possible to put an extended magazine into this gun, and this one in particular holds 31 rounds of 9mm ammunition, or even what's called a drum magazine, a round drum of ammunition in there. That will also fit into this gun, and that would put 50 rounds of ammunition into the gun without having to worry about reloading. We'll talk more about how these magazines go into many different types of guns, because obviously that looks kind of ridiculous, and this wouldn't be something you'd be carrying around for personal defense. But inside of a long gun, like this one here, which I'll get to later, that shoots 9mm rounds, for home defense, this might be the kind of thing that you would find much more reasonable in that size package. This, again, is a very typical gun for home defense. It's a little bit on the larger side for personal defense. Remember that I said that you'd be most likely to come into contact with a semi-automatic handgun, because that is the most common gun being carried by the 60 million people who can legally carry all around the country. And I happen to be carrying a much smaller version of the Glock. You can see it's a little bit thinner, and it's generally smaller. This gun does not hold as many rounds. This gun only holds 10, or if I were to load the chamber and then put a full magazine in, 11 rounds, as opposed to the 18 rounds that I can put in this gun. But this gun is much easier to carry. So a compact 9mm is the kind of gun that you're much more likely to see being carried around, if someone would bring into your office, for example. Again, you'll never know unless they are telling you about it, or they need to use it to defend you or others in that space. This is also a semi-automatic handgun. You can see that it looks a little bit different. It's got a lot of other things going on. This gun is set up for home defense. It could also be very similar to a gun that would be set up for handgun competitions. And the major difference when we look at this, there's really two things here that are dramatically different about this gun. One is that it has a flashlight attached to it. So that law enforcement, is very, very common that they will put a light on the end of their gun, so that if they're searching for someone, or if they're having to go into a dark house or into a dark space and tell someone to comply with their orders and come out with their hands up, kind of a thing. Having a light on the gun means that they can control that gun better, but also get the benefit of the light illuminating the person that they're dealing with, the bad guy, right? Or letting them know that that's not the bad guy and it's not someone they should shoot. Now, we want to be really careful in our training. We talk about not turning the gun into a flashlight. So I don't want to start using this just forgetting that it's a gun with a flashlight on there. And that's why we generally don't recommend putting a light on a gun, except for people who are much more trained and experienced in having another light. Maybe they have a regular flashlight in their hand. This is going to be their backup light. And again, law enforcement, military, like that, maybe a highly trained civilian, but even for home defense, at my level, I keep a separate flashlight, and I've been doing this for a long time, because I don't want to turn my gun into a flashlight. That's where we start getting potential complacency, and we have some of those tragedies that we want to avoid. The other major difference about this gun, which is maybe not as obvious to someone looking at it who isn't familiar with firearms, is that this pistol has a red dot sight on top of it. And what that means is when I drive this gun out into my field of view, I don't have to line up the sights, the front and rear sight, to control, or should I say predict, where the bullet is going to go. This glass panel on the front of, or on the top of this gun actually has a red dot floating in there. And if I put that red dot over the thing that I want to hit and I press the trigger smoothly enough, that bullet's going to go where that red dot is in my field of vision. So it makes aiming a little bit easier, especially under specific circumstances like a further shot. We're seeing these red dots used more and more by law enforcement or people interested in defensive carry. Traditionally, they've just been a lot bigger and less durable, less reliable. So we've only seen them used in competition by competition shooters. But you may see, again, very many different variations on the theme of a handle that takes a magazine and a slide that reciprocates on top of the gun. Semi-automatic handguns, again, being the most common guns that you're going to find. Before I leave the area of handguns, I also want to address this issue of ghost guns. If you look at these two guns, they're very similar. They're both Glock-style semi-automatic guns. This gun takes exactly the same magazine that this one does. The one here is the Glock. This is the factory manufactured stable of, or the most common gun in the stable of guns that Glock has. It's the Glock 17. This is a ghost gun. This is a privately manufactured gun built from a kit to take parts from the Glock factory or parts that are aftermarket parts that would fit onto a Glock gun, and again take the same kinds of magazines, fires the same kind of bullet, very much behaves exactly like that. And one of the issues that we have is that the primary person who's building this type of a gun is a hobbyist. There's someone who already has all of these other types of guns, almost certainly has one of these that they've filled out a background check for, they have the concealed carry permit, they've gone through all these hoops already. They buy this kit and they want to build their own gun, understand what's going on inside of it more, maybe personalize it, really have something they can be proud of. For some people, they even do this like with 3D printers, where they print the frame and then they put the Glock parts into it, and it really becomes a work of art or a craft, if you will, like woodworking or anything else. And that may sound weird to somebody outside of the gun culture, but for us, if I've got all of these guns and I've sort of gotten bored with just buying guns, I want to make my own, well, this is how it works. And under our laws around the vast majority of the country, federally, I do not have to put a serial number on this. I don't have to go through a background check to own this, and I think that's okay. Some people might disagree and say they think all guns we should have to have background checks for. But it's really important to understand that while ghost guns, guns without serial numbers that are privately manufactured, in most cases, are very much denigrated in our community and in our culture right now, and we hear a lot of, I think, hyperbolic statements about them. Fact is, 99.9% of these guns are in the hands of hobbyists who already own very similar guns and certainly much more powerful guns in many ways. And they're not a threat to anybody, and they're not a problem. They're not used in crime very often. I just want to take that moment because it's a politically charged topic in the U.S. right now to say that the ghost gun is really the same as the regular gun, and it's usually in the hands of someone that owns the regular gun as well. So we don't want to get too worked up over those things. Leaving handguns for a minute, we're going to go into the rifles. And I've already talked a little bit about these two, so let me go back to those. Again, a semi-automatic 22 caliber rifle. This is a black gun. It's got plastic. It doesn't have wood. As I said, this gun is one of the most ubiquitous guns in the firearms community, the Ruger 1022. It uses a box magazine, which I don't have within reach right now. Oh, yeah, I do. It uses a magazine like this that actually has a rotating cylinder on the inside, so it sort of combines the way a revolver works and the way a semi-automatic works, and that holds 10 rounds. Now again, with this gun, I can have a magazine that extends that might hold 20 rounds, 30 rounds, 50 rounds. I've seen 100-round drum magazines, like we talked about with the handgun, that also could fit this gun. When you pull the trigger, one round goes out, empty case pops out, another round goes into the chamber, and then I can pull the trigger and fire again. This is exactly the same mechanism that works in hundreds of firearms models that are available for civilian purchase in the U.S. and are used primarily by law enforcement as well. Fully automatic guns are legal to own, but you have to pay an extra fee, you have to go through an extra background check, and you have to agree to certain extra rules with the government as regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to own them. But they're not very common in civilian hands in the U.S., and they're also not very common being used by law enforcement in the U.S. Now, the military does primarily issue fully automatic guns, but those guns have multiple settings, semi-automatic and fully automatic, and fully automatic is very rarely used. It's not really good for a whole lot of things in terms of controlling what's happening with the gun and precisely putting the bullets where you want them to put, and conserving ammunition so that you're more efficient. So even in a defensive situation or in a law enforcement activity with a semi-automatic, or with a rifle that could be semi-automatic or fully automatic, generally we would choose semi-automatic. So again, automatic firearms, sometimes the word automatic firearm is used to apply to semi-automatic, but people don't understand the difference. So they assume we're now talking about machine guns, and that's simply not the case. If you were to ban all semi-automatic guns, if you were to ban all the guns that operate like an AR-15 in the US, that would include, I'm sure, millions of guns like this, which you might hunt a squirrel with, but it's not a very powerful gun, and it's a very common gun. It's the kind of gun a lot of kids learn how to shoot on. Lots of competitions and lots of just fun with guns happens. Very therapeutic fun with guns for a lot of people happen with that type of firearm. While we're talking about semi-automatics, let's get into the AR-15. I've been told sometimes people will watch these videos that we do or attend one of our live seminars or even the in-person seminars, and the minute I pick this up, there's like a change in the atmosphere. I've got the dreaded semi-automatic, quote-unquote, assault rifle type AR-15 gun. Well, again, not to get too much into the semantics, but assault rifle, that is a term that has been traditionally used in the military to talk about a rifle that would be used in an offensive capacity and to assault, the enemy position, to respond to an ambush by assaulting through the enemy that's set up on the hillside, trying to take out your patrol. That weapon is going to be a very powerful weapon. It's going to be, again, a weapon that almost always is capable of fully automatic fire. The guns that are in the hands of civilians overwhelmingly are not capable of fully automatic fire, but they look like and they fire the same rounds as, in many cases, the military select fire weapons. I can select semi-auto or fully auto. Now, this AR-15 is very standard. It's not the traditional AR-15 that has what we call a carry handle back here that you might see in the older movies, the Vietnam era, when these guns first started being used by the military. This is what we call a flat top. The vast majority of AR-15s that are sold today and for the last 10 to 15 years have been flat top ARs. There are approximately 40 million of these guns in circulation around the US in the hands of millions of responsible gun owners. They are used very rarely in crimes, but they are used at a higher percentage of time in the tragic mass shootings, the spree killings, the mass murders that make the headlines. We do see a lot of these show up. But again, it's sort of like there are more Honda Civics and Ford F-150s involved in traffic accidents than there are Ferraris, right? Because there aren't that many Ferraris out on the road, but there's lots and lots of F-150s and Honda Civics. The AR-15 is the same way. If a criminal is going to break into somebody's house and steal a gun, there's a really good chance they're going to come away with one of these. If a criminal goes somewhere to buy a gun for malicious intent, the guns they're going to see for sale today are going to look more like one of these. So it's not so much the I don't want that gun, I don't want that gun, that's the gun I need because it's the only one capable of being used in a crime. It's just statistically this gun is more common. While this may trigger some emotional feelings when I pick it up and I start holding it and I show it to you and we talk about the safety selector, this is going to fire and now I could press the trigger, and much like this Ruger 22 target pistol, it's a very light, crisp trigger, very easy to shoot. I talked about it having a flat top. This one has sights that are far apart, which, as I told you earlier, means that I can have a higher level of precision because if they're close together, there's more variable. The further apart they are and the narrower this diameter, when I'm looking through that peep sight back there with this eye closed, looking through that hole at this top of that post and putting it over my target, these can be very accurate guns. But something you should know about this particular gun, it shoots the same little 22 caliber bullet that we've been talking about all along in the recreational guns and in the target pistol. This is a 22 caliber AR. The AR-15, when we hear in the news media that how incredibly powerful it is and how it shoots at super high velocity and you can blow lungs out or decapitate people, the vast majority of AR-15s do not fire what any gun owner, anyone who's an expert in the field of firearms would consider a powerful round. There was a shooting in Illinois in 2022 during the summer where a police officer made the statement right after the shooting that they weren't sure what type of gun was used, but he knew it was a high-powered rifle. And it kicked off a huge debate in the gun community and conversation in the media about, what does it mean to be high powered? I don't want you to mishear me. The rounds that are generally shot out of a typical AR-15 type firearm, which is what I'm now holding, a gun that is designed to fire a mid-level rifle cartridge, the 223 or 5.56 millimeter. This is the round that's primarily issued by our military and used by our military, but not around the world. The rounds that are issued to most militaries around the world are actually more powerful than the 5.56 and 223. They are heavy. They shoot heavier bullets at a higher velocity. They are definitely more lethal than this round is. But this is the most common round in the U.S., and it is absolutely lethal. It's the round that's used by law enforcement. It's a round that's used for hunting of small game, varmints. You might shoot at coyotes, for example, with this round, but in most states, it would be illegal for you to try to harvest a white-tailed deer with this bullet. This bullet is not powerful enough. According to the Fish and Game, Department of Natural Resources, in most states, you cannot hunt the average deer that you see standing on the side of the highway, a cute little animal. This round is not considered powerful enough to ethically use to hunt them. And yet we hear on the media about how powerful it is. Now, again, I pointed out that this AR-15 shoots that tiny little 22 round. This is a typical AR-15 that shoots this mid-caliber, mid-powered caliber round. There are AR-15 style firearms that shoot much larger rounds, much more powerful rounds. So when someone says an AR-15 is capable of X, Y, or Z, 0.5% of the ARs manufactured in the US probably do shoot rounds that are more powerful than the typical one. But 90% of the ARs in the US shoot this round or one that's significantly less powerful, the 22 or even a pistol caliber. There are many AR-15 type firearms that shoot pistol caliber rounds, 9mm, 45 caliber, 40 caliber, and they're much easier to shoot. There are whole divisions of competitions for pistol caliber carbines, and we have to remember that as well. So again, the AR-15, ubiquitous, incredibly versatile. It can be set up. This one has a red dot sight, like I described to you earlier. We can also have different kinds of magazines. The typical magazine will hold 30 rounds. This is not a high capacity magazine. This is the standard capacity. Some people will argue and say, well, the original gun for the military used 20 round magazines. So a 30 round magazine would be considered a higher capacity. But most people who talk about high capacity magazines and wanting to put in magazine ban restrictions, they're talking about limiting to 10 rounds. Or in some cases 15 rounds, like the state of Colorado has a 15 round capacity limit for new magazines sold into the civilian market. So 20 rounds would still be considered a higher capacity, even though by any argument, that's the lowest number of rounds you would have as a standard capacity for an AR-15. But for the last 3 decades, 3+ decades, the 30 round magazines have been the standard for the AR-15 family of firearms. Again, a lot of different types of configurations, all different kinds of colors, different kinds of sizes. This particular one, you notice this grip is different color than the actual body of the gun. This grip has a lock built into it. This is another company that's closely associated with Walk Talk America called Advon, and this is a new product that when we use a key to lock this handle, it locks the safety mechanism so that the gun cannot be taken off safe, can't be fired. So you probably wouldn't just leave this gun out where a child could touch it if you were a responsible firearms owner, but if you did have it somewhere where someone was able to get their hands on it, but you had it locked, once again, they wouldn't be able to use it. They would not be able to fire the gun. They wouldn't be a danger to themselves or others because of this integral lock that's built into the handle of the gun. Now that's something that I personally, and I think Walk Talk America feels personally or feels professionally and as an entity that this should be an option, absolutely should be an option if people want to put it on there, but these kinds of things shouldn't be government mandated. It increases the cost and it potentially makes the gun less reliable if these aren't high quality parts. And of course, if it's a high quality part, it's going to be more expensive. And now we start getting into restricting people's rights. So while I point out that this is on here, I also want to point out that that doesn't mean every gun should have one. And certainly it's not the case in the US that every gun has one. So moving from the AR-15 up to a much more powerful gun, which is one that I held earlier, this hunting rifle. And I did pick up this round. This round is what our military used through World War I and up into World War II. We were using a much more powerful round than the one that we use today. Even the round that is in between these two. This is a 30-06. This is, again, the 22 caliber. It's a 223 Remington, or a 5.56 millimeter. This is a 30 caliber round, the 30-06, and the 308 is in between them. That is also a round that has been used by our military. The M14 used that round. But going back, when you watch Saving Private Ryan, and they're shooting the gun, and they fire a certain number of rounds, and you hear a ping, and that clip pops out that I mentioned earlier, that disposable clip. These are the rounds that were in those guns. Those guns were much heavier than the AR-15, and obviously shot a much more powerful round than the AR-15. Well, that round is a very, very popular hunting round in the United States, and it's very typical of the kind of round that's going to be shot out of a gun like this. It's important to note that the bolt action, the short, crisp trigger, the 4 points of contact, and the magnified scope with the reticle inside of it, these are all also features of quote-unquote sniper rifles. So when you think about someone, as a sniper, as this potentially, nefarious person who's hiding on a rooftop or on a tree line or in a hill, on a hillside, and shooting into a crowd, or shooting at an assassin, sniping at someone, basically what you're talking about is hunting. And obviously that could be a very criminal, tragic, malicious, negative outcome of a gun that's very powerful and very accurate. They could kill someone from far away. Relatively slow to fire compared to a handgun or the semi-automatic AR-15, but much, much more powerful. In the hands of law enforcement and military snipers, these types of guns save a lot of lives, because it allows one person to be far away from the enemy, spot the enemy potentially attacking some of our troops, or attacking a compound, or attacking a checkpoint, and take them out very efficiently from far away. Just like we do when we hunt. We see a deer out in the woods, and we can very ethically and efficiently put that deer down, and then maybe put the trophy on the wall, but definitely put the meat in the freezer too. So these guns are very powerful, very accurate, and if we were really going to say, well, we don't want the powerful guns to be out in the civilian hands, we don't want the guns that can penetrate body armor to be out in civilian hands. We don't want the guns that can kill people with a very high level of lethality or efficiency because they're so powerful in civilian hands. This would really be the gun that you're talking about, much more than the AR-15 at the end of the day. So we need to keep that in mind as well. So the bolt-action hunting rifle, again, very, very common. The last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of rifles is this gun. Now, this gun is one that uses the same magazines as the Glock. It's a 9mm pistol, technically, but you can see that the way it's configured, I'm going to have my 4 points of contact with this gun, just like I did with a rifle. Now, the reason this is a pistol and not a rifle is just a nuance of the convoluted gun laws in the United States of America. For practical purposes, this is used very, very similarly to a semi-automatic rifle, but because it's technically a pistol, this device back here is technically a brace, a pistol brace, and not a stock. But again, when you talk to gun owners and they complain about the laws in the US and the fact that they're incredibly restrictive, and they're sometimes vague, and they're very convoluted, and they overlap and potentially even contradict each other sometimes from state to state or from federal to state. Municipalities even have their own laws in some states. There aren't state unified laws. You can get things to be very confusing very quickly. And sometimes we see people run afoul of the law with absolutely no criminal intent, simply because of the parts or the pieces that they put on their gun at any given time. Some guns are only legal, or some parts, accessories, are only legal on rifles. Some are meant for pistols. You put them on rifles, you probably aren't breaking the law, but the ones that are meant for rifles that fit on pistols could put you in a position of breaking the law. And it really all goes back to the 1920s and gang warfare. It was seen as a potentially threatening to law enforcement that a gangster in a trench coat could have a rifle hidden under his trench coat and very quickly bring it out and use a powerful gun to hurt law enforcement or to defend their illegal, alcohol operation. And so the National Firearms Act made short-barreled rifles illegal in the U.S. And that's why this is technically a pistol and this is technically a brace, even though it's going to be treated operationally out on the range or for home defense or even in competition very much like a long gun. So some insight into the nuances of gun law and how confusing it can be. And that gets us back to the shotgun. So this shotgun, you can see it's got a very long barrel. This one is set up for duck hunting or maybe trap shooting, but any kind of bird hunting, you're going to want a longer barrel. And what happens here is you can see written on this side, maybe it says number 8. That means it has a certain size of shot inside of this hull. There are in this particular load size, and this is only a 20 gauge, my guess is there are probably about 200 pellets inside of this, but they're incredibly small pellets. So when you fire them out of this shotgun, those 200 pellets start to spread out, and when you get 20 or 30 or 40 yards away from the muzzle, that might be, you know, a full arm's reach worth of pellets. So you'd have pellets covering from my fingertip, you know, back into my chest, and that cloud of pellets is intended to hit a dove or hit a duck and drop it out of the sky. Now those pellets would actually be too small to drop something like a goose, you know, or a duck farther away, but you can get a much smaller number of pellets that are much heavier into a shotgun, and that's the idea of the shot. So when we look at this round, this is a clear round, you can kind of see those little pellets inside of there. Those little balls in there are each pellets. This is buckshot. You might hear double-aught buck. This looks like, to me, it's number 1 buck, and there's probably about 30 pellets in there. So there are 25 to 30 pellets inside of there. Each one of them is smaller than the bullet being shot out of this 9mm round. So the 9mm handgun fires that one round. These pellets are all probably about half the weight of that 9mm bullet, but you got 25 or 30 of them coming out of this shotgun all at once. And once again, the further you get away from that shotgun, the more they spread out. So shotguns are generally used for clay targets that are flying through the air, little discs that are meant to burst when you hit them with any of these little pellets, birds. In the past, law enforcement relied on the shotgun as a defensive tool that upgraded from a revolver, most likely in that era, or a semi-automatic pistol. But overwhelmingly, law enforcement and people interested in home defense have turned to the semi-automatic rifle because it's much more controllable. It's easier to shoot. Generally, these are lighter than the heavier, longer shotguns. So we see people with rifles in the role that shotguns used to fill. This also is a shotgun. This shotgun is maybe more what you think of, the traditional hunting gun. Once again, it's got that long barrel. This would be a gun used for dove, for quail, something like that, possibly for duck. This is a lighter gun than this one, and it shoots the smaller 20 gauge shell rather than the 12 gauge shell. You can see the difference in diameter there. Of course, that means more power and more pellets for any given shot size coming out of the 12 gauge one. But this one, notice, is semi-automatic. So this one is one where I'll load it, and once it's loaded, pull the trigger, round fires, this action goes back and forth, the old hull comes out, the new shot goes in, and I press the trigger again. So this has exactly the same type of operation that the dreaded AR-15 does, that this semi-automatic target pistol does, that the Glock 9mm does, that this Ruger 22 recreational pistol does, or recreational rifle, I should say, does. This is a semi-automatic shotgun. So one of the things I wanted you to get out of this overview is the idea that there are some distinct differences in types of firearms, from the power, from the number of rounds they fire, from the mechanisms that they use, from their weight to their controllability, the precision, what they're generally intended for, and how they're generally used. But it's not easy to say, if you got rid of all of those guns, the world would be a better place, because those guns probably overlap with a huge number of guns that are generally never used in crime and almost never involved in any types of negative outcomes. It is important to remember the number one negative outcome with a firearm is suicide. People take their own lives with whichever gun happens to be in their hand when that impulse strikes or when they determine they're going to execute their plan to take their own life. It really doesn't matter. Every single one of the guns that I have picked up and shown you today, from the 30-06 incredibly powerful hunting rifle all the way down to any of these 22 caliber guns, can be used to take a life. Certainly I could use any of them to take my own life. And it's important to remember that not only is the smallest round here, the round that's incredibly common in the US, capable of taking a life, one bullet is capable of taking a life. So it doesn't matter if I have the 50-round drum, it doesn't matter if I have a shotgun that only holds 3 rounds because that's what the legal limit would be for a hunting season. Doesn't matter if it's a revolver that's slow to reload. It doesn't matter if it's the AR-15 shooting the 22, the 5.56, or a very powerful, belted Magnum that's capable of being fired at someone 2 miles away. 1 round from any of these guns could be involved in that tragedy of suicide. So affecting the behavior, treating the person, thinking about the impulses or the determination to do the violent act or to use violence even against oneself, that's really where we have to be focused. It can't be on any one of these inanimate objects. I hope that this Guns 101 overview was helpful for you in understanding maybe just some of the complexities of the firearm world, but also maybe some of the details of the guns you heard about, guns that your clients, people that you want to treat, people you want to take care of, or your friends and family may own. Maybe a gun that you yourself would be interested in owning or joining any of us out on the range and shooting, where I would love to see you. Thank you for being interested in what Walk the Talk America does, and thank you for being dedicated to helping the firearms community avoid negative outcomes.